There's an old Irish tale that says, in a twilight world somewhere between heaven and hell, there lives a race of magical, mischievous beings. Of course, we don't believe in such things anymore. But beware. The tale has a cruel twist. The less we believe, it says, the more we have to fear. Ever since there were people in Ireland, stories have been told of the magical She, a race of shadowy, elusive beings. They're the little people, like the crafty leprechaun and his crock of gold. The mermaid who lures sailors to their doom. And the banshee, with her blood-curdling cry. We've all heard these lovely old fantasies, but that's all they are, right? Fairy tales, make-believe, innocent bedtime stories and childish superstitions. Nobody could possibly believe them in this day and age. And so we rest assured, knowing we're wiser and more sophisticated than fools who think otherwise. But bear one thing in mind. According to legend, the victims of these creatures are always the non-believers. And many of the old tales aren't quite so harmless either. Even the most famous of them all, the legend of the leprechaun.
The leprechaun's a very tricky wee boy. And the one thing is you should never take your eyes off him, because he'll trick you if he can. There was a young fellow called Michael Grady one time, walking through the fields, and he heard the tap, tap, tap.
Suddenly,
tap,
as the
tap,
story
tap.
goes, Michael caught sight of a leprechaun. Quick as a flash, he grabbed hold of the little fellow and demanded his pot of gold. Now the leprechaun knew he was trapped, so he took Michael to a certain tree in the middle of a nearby wood. Beneath this tree, he declared, was the treasure. All Michael had to do was dig it out. Michael knew his tiny captive would escape if he left, so he made the leprechaun swear an oath.
I'm going to do something and you have to make me a promise. You have to make me a promise that if I mark that tree with this red garter around my leg, you'll keep that ribbon on it. A promise, said the leprechaun. Now, are you sure? A promise on my pot of gold. Right, said Michael. And he set the wee man down and tied the ribbon round the tree. And on
So off Michael ran to fetch his spade.
into his own house, grabbed the spade, away came.
When he returned, the leprechaun was gone. But the little fellow had kept his promise. A red ribbon was tied to every tree in sight.
He'd never find out which one the pot of gold was under unless he dug up the whole forest. Sure, all he could do was laugh. But it just goes to show, never trust a leprechaun. They're tricky boys.
A little superstitious mischief never harmed anyone, we might think. And yet, some would say that mischief is the least of our worries. For these creatures are said to have a much darker side. All across Ireland are places linked to this dark side of fairy magic. Lonely thorn trees, standing stones and old forts, it's said, should be avoided at all costs. Disturb them and run the risk of incurring a fairy's wrath. Of course, that's just quaint superstition, isn't it? Like all so-called haunting tales, there's really nothing to fear. That's just what a certain fiddle player thought. But as the story goes, he lived to regret it.
Well, this was a great fiddler, and he was coming home from a big do. And he could have gone round the road, but there was
The fiddler was making his way home one night when he decided to take a short cut across some fields. Before long, he found himself passing by a rath or fairy fort. And there on the rim of the fort were the fairy folk, calling out for him to join them.
Come in, Paddy. Come in, Paddy. We want you to play for us.
Hardly able to believe what was happening, he entered the ring and began to play for his strange hosts.
And he went, and the first thing they gave him was some great drink, and he loved it. And on he went playing, and they kept dancing all round him. And it went on for a
The
while.
hours passed, and as the fairies danced around him, urging him to play faster and faster, they filled his pockets with gold and his belly with drink.
On it went like that for what Paddy thought was the night. And at last they said, well...
Finally, as dawn began to break, they sent him on his way, bewildered but happy, his pockets filled with glittering coins.
And when he got near the house, here was the...
When he reached his house, he was surprised to find a young man standing at his door.
He says, what are you doing here?
"You have no business here," said the man. "You've been gone 2 years, and I've married your wife." Suddenly, the fiddler realized he'd been tricked. Quickly, he reached for the gold, but all he found was horse dung.
And here they were filled with horse manure, and no gold. It was horse manure.
Still, a pocketful of horse manure and a little stolen time seem harmless enough. And besides, it's all in fun, right? Just a fairy tale. There's really nothing to fear. Or is there? Like thieves, it's said, the fairy folk covet what we treasure most. Many believe they are harbingers of death, in league with the grim reaper himself. It is said that those who have heard the cry of the banshee, or the tap of her nails on the window pane in the dead of night, will soon know the true meaning of loss. Even the most innocent, many claim, have reason to fear. Those who believe the old tales say the fairies are stealers of children. In cradles where infants are put down for the night, they leave changelings, withered creatures who quickly waste away and die. According to legend, the stolen child will never grow old. Instead, it will live forever young in a realm without time. Discount it at your peril, because this realm, like the fairies themselves, has always been a mystery. Its existence has never been proved, but most mysterious of all, it has never been disproved either. Fairy tales, let's face it, are little more than children's stories and harmless superstitions. Only the very young or the very foolish could believe in them. We are too sophisticated. We know better. We have nothing to fear. Or do we? To many, even today, fairies are not the cute, gossamer-winged creatures of children's fiction. Those who believe speak of ghostly shapeshifters, spirits that can appear in any form, even that of humans. So how can we be absolutely certain we've never seen one? One old story tells of a fisherman in the north of Ireland who falls in love with a mermaid. Refusing to believe she's one of the fairy folk, he sets out to possess her.
And eventually a wise woman can give him the advice that he needs. And he realises that every evening this beautiful girl unclips her tail and turns into a human for a certain amount of time as she sits by the sea singing. And so he steals the tail. And with the tail he takes her power. And so she must follow him home. And in the course of time this pair have 2 children. And the children are out playing one day and it's raining. And they rush into the barn to play and they're throwing straw around. And they dig down through the straw in their game and they come to this shiny iridescent thing under some old mouldy straw that hasn't been interrupted for years. And when the mother saw this beautiful shining iridescent thing lying in among the straw, she realised it was her tail. And she sent her children back into the house and she clipped the tail on and she flung herself off the highest cliffs and sang her way back out to sea, very happy at last. But when her husband came home that night, he was devastated to realise that his bride had gone and he never saw her again. He was very, very unhappy. But at night, when the children are asleep, she would come back into the house and she would comb their hair and smile and sing to them because she was happy to be back reunited with her own people at last.
A new version of an old tale, we might think. And yet, according to the local superstition of Rathlin Island on the northeast coast, the story is true. Here it's said, the descendants of that same mermaid live on. They can be identified, or so it's claimed, by the webs of skin between their toes. Brave indeed are those who would go there asking for proof. According to legend, the fairies are elusive, crafty creatures who can appear and disappear without trace. This, of course, is quite convenient for the wee folk. After all, if they are invisible, who's to say they don't exist? Some, however, actually claim to have found proof. During the 19th century in the southwest of Ireland, a farm labourer came across a strange object. He believed it was an actual shoe belonging to the fairies. Terrified of the bad luck that might befall him if he kept it, he quickly passed it on. Strange as it may seem, it still exists.
This is a shoe that was found first in 1834, and there are several strange things about it. First, you will see that it shows signs of wear in the sole and heel. Secondly, it's been at some time mended rather clumsily. There are 2 heavy stitches in the back of the heel itself. At one time it's had laces. You can just see the eyelet holes at the end there. I've shown it to a cobbler. He tells me that it's as good work as any cobbler could do. Indeed better, because of its size, and you can see how small it is. I've also shown it to the curator of a doll's museum, and she says that it's certainly not a doll's shoe. It's far too well made for that. It would be interesting to have the leather tested in a laboratory. I've not had this done, but in order to do it properly, you'd have to snip a bit off the shoe, and I think that would probably, the fairies mightn't like that, might they?
Such fears may seem harmless enough, but others aren't quite so innocent. The poet W.B. Yeats once wrote, "Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand." This poem, The Stolen Child, has always had a bittersweet message. In the past, the legend of the changeling, the child stolen by the fairies, was never meant to entertain, and it often resonated with genuine tragedy.
There were changeling traditions. If your baby wasn't doing particularly well, perhaps it had been changed. It wasn't that the child was in some way handicapped or disadvantaged. The wee folk were to blame. They had substituted one of their own. Women in childbirth were often taken away by the fairies. Again, maternal mortality being an extraordinarily high, there's an extraordinarily high risk of maternal mortality here. And so fairies came to play, came to interact directly in people's lives in this kind of way, and could be blamed for all sorts of mishaps or things which might naturally go wrong, which were otherwise difficult to explain.
Crib death, Down syndrome, all sorts of maladies that affect the young might have been the cause of such superstitions. And by rights, medical science should have put an end to the changeling tradition 100 years ago. But strangely, it didn't. Even today, there are many still alive who remember ash being smeared on the faces of young children to ward off the wee folk. According to the changeling legend, the fairies are discerning, meticulous thieves, and filthy youngsters are of no interest to them. Once, customs like these were common. The little folk were spoken of in hushed voices. Certain places were said to be inhabited by the fairies, mounds and thorns and trees. Those who interfered with them, according to local superstition, risked a fate worse than death. Innocent nonsense, we might assume these days. But one fact remains. These places still exist. And to this day, even those who say they don't believe will never destroy them, dig them up, or even till the soil nearby. Why? What could they possibly have to fear? All over Ireland there are trees, ancient standing stones and hills, which, legend has it, are possessed by the fairies. Tamper with them, it's said, and you risk disaster. A quaint old custom, perhaps. But if this is the case, why do farmers still refuse to plough the soil where they stand? Why are modern roads and motorways diverted instead of passing through them? Why, in an age of rational thought, are these places still considered untouchable? Has an entire country gone mad? Or is it simply safer not to tamper with things we don't understand? Despite their strange appearance, many fairy forts, as we might suspect, are quite innocent. Some are raths, island homesteads which were common in Ireland right up to medieval times. But others have a much more ominous background. These are the tombs of Ireland's prehistoric ancestors, ancient mausoleums of stone and earth where the dead were buried over 4,000 years ago. Later, with the arrival of the Celtic people who came to Ireland centuries before the time of Christ, these old graveyards began to be seen as strange, supernatural places.
They knew that these tombs weren't part of the natural landscape. They knew that some peoples somehow had built them, but these were mysterious peoples of the past, so that they situated their continental Celtic gods in these tombs in Ireland, in these old rats in the landscape. And also the Celts had a belief that when one dies, one doesn't just disappear, that one lives on in another world beside this world. So that within these ancient tombs and within these ancient artifacts in the landscape, they believed that the other world people lived on.
Even with the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century, belief in this mysterious world of the dead survived. Gradually, as paganism disappeared, the tombs became ghostly monuments to every god and goddess, every banished demon and lost soul of Ireland's heathen past. Despite the disapproval of the church, the old superstitions refused to disappear. Right up to the last century, for example, iron tongs were often laid across the tops of cradles. The custom seems bizarre now, but once it made perfect sense. To the Celts, iron was believed to ward off evil spirits, and so many centuries later, the folk memory survived, and iron tongs, like horseshoes, became good luck charms. Strangely, even now, in a time when such beliefs are considered totally irrational, they linger on. And still today, many of those who claim they don't believe wouldn't dare put the old superstitions to the test.
Well, fairies in a sense are spirits, but whether they exist or not, I don't personally believe in them, but belief is a matter of emotion as well as of rationale, and I wouldn't interfere with a fairy fort. That is an old earthenwork fort in the landscape. We are told that if you dig up one of these forts, or if you cut down a fairy tree, a tree standing all alone in the landscape, if you cut that down, some bad luck will befall you. So that even though rationally I wouldn't believe in them, I wouldn't like to interfere with these places nevertheless.
Even when fairy forts occupied valuable land, which could be used for farming, roads, homes, they were never disturbed. And there are many who are still convinced of their magical power.
I know a man, I went to school with him in fact, and he would swear that he saw a leprechaun seated on the edge of a fort one morning, shaving himself, and no matter how hard he was questioned, he still persisted in the belief that he did see a leprechaun in the vicinity of the fort. So, you know, that belief was very, very strong that they were the abodes of fairies, hence the name Fairy Fort.
In the modern world, the superstition which once surrounded the fairy folk has faded. But strange as it may seem, a great many people still believe. Why? Is it simply that old habits die hard? Or could there really be more to the legends than we think? These days we are tempted to dismiss fairy legends as tall tales and harmless superstitions. But why then do so many cling to the old ways? Is it just force of habit? Or could it be something more sinister? Fear, perhaps.
So even if people are inclined to say, oh, I don't believe in fairies, they're still very aware of the power of the fairies. And so they function in all kinds of ways. They can directly or indirectly actually govern people's behaviour. And on a more symbolic level, they reflect the fact that there are great environmental and supernatural forces which play upon people's realisations in all kinds of ways that perhaps they don't always account for.
In the past, people's behaviour was governed in more earthly ways too. And certain fairy tales had very little to do with magic. A returned emigrant, for instance, a cheating husband or wife, even a drunken farmer, could always blame their mysterious disappearance on the fairies. They hadn't simply gone missing, they had been lost in a fairy field, or kidnapped by the wee folk. Certainly at times, the little people provided an all too convenient alibi. Most today say the fairies no longer exist. Christianity, they claim, has long since stamped out all trace of their existence and banished the pagan beliefs which kept them alive. According to some, the last of the fairies died out around 30 years ago. Since then, it is said, there have been so many masses and prayers offered up for the dead that Ireland has been cleansed of all superstition. Christianity, it seems, has finally banished the fairies. And yet, 30 years ago, exactly the same thing was said. And 30 years before that. And 30 years before that. No doubt, 30 years from now, it will be said again. Even the legends, it seems, are elusive. Fairies, you see, are never connected with the present, always with the past. Surprisingly, even the famous leprechaun is a latecomer to fairy lore. Like the mermaid, this mischievous elf-like figure was only introduced to Ireland during medieval times. Although few will risk bad luck by admitting it, the king of the fairies is little more than a colourful impostor.
Fairies are largely superstition now, but there has to be some basis. In fact, for them, or it wouldn't have survived for this long, and especially since the church had such an influence on the lives of people back 50, 60, 100 years ago. Why would religious people still do these things in tribute to fairies? They're going against the church's teaching as such. It's possible that the little people do exist. I wouldn't like to test it out by insulting them.
But what of the fairies' most intriguing legend, the elusive crock of gold? It's just a myth, of course. But can we be so sure? During the 19th century, a County Limerick farmer risked a lifetime of bad luck by planting rows of potatoes in a fairy fort on his land. But later, as he tilled the soil, he unearthed a goblet of solid gold, encrusted with jewels. It was the Ardagh chalice, a priceless piece of 9th century church art which had been wisely hidden in the fort to protect it from theft. For 10 centuries, people's belief in the fairies had kept it safe. Since then, things have certainly changed. The original fairy fort is all but destroyed now, but the chalice is displayed in the National Museum of Ireland as the nation's most valuable treasure. Perhaps, as many say, belief in the little folk was never more than just superstition. But superstition or not, the fairies kept Ireland's most priceless treasure safe for 1,000 years. And even today, many people, whether they say they believe or not, are still not willing to defy the little people or go against the old taboos. Because, heaven forbid, they might actually be real. Are you prepared to take that risk?